So every now and then, Matt Walsh and I will agree on something, and not directly, we don't know each other, but our beliefs will line up. And he actually said something that I agree with, which is that pornography does not produce an addiction. Pornography is not habit forming, it is not addictive. He talked about this extensively on his show recently, and he's absolutely right to say that, for example, heroin, which produces a chemical dependency in the user, if you quit heroin cold turkey, you can have a heart attack and die. The same thing can occur in certain cases of suspending alcohol use cold turkey. Pardon me. There are severe withdrawal symptoms. Pornography has no chemical dependency factor. It produces no withdrawal symptoms. I can actually speak to this with some authority because I take an SSRI, and I have for multiple decades now. And at two points in my life, I have attempted to go off of that SSRI to see if I could now function without it. I take it for anxiety and depression. And I've attempted to see if I could function without it. And the withdrawal symptoms are so extreme that I've never really been able to get to the point of getting off of it completely. If I go for about 3 or 4 days without it, I will start to feel like I'm walking around in a fog. I will start to feel like my every motion takes a tremendous amount of strength. After about a week, I will be having chaotic bursts of panic and confusion, not things that are readily apparent to other people, but things that are shaking me up on the inside. And then by about 2 weeks, I will be having chest pains so severe that it feels like somebody is taking their hands and trying to rip my rib cage open. And the first time that happened, I actually checked into the emergency room because I thought I was legitimately having a heart attack, and it turned out it was just with anxiety and withdrawal symptoms and that kind of thing. I did the second time I tried it. I stepped it back gradually and was able to get a better idea of what I would be like without the medication, and my depression got so low that I could barely function. Anyway, by contrast, for the last 2 months, I've been without regular internet access because I've been moving from one apartment to another, and, the lack of access to internet porn has not really fazed me one way or the other. Anyway, all of that said, Matt Walsh moves on into some topics that are, where he is unbelievably wrong on so many levels. Now, I want to say something if you're just joining us. I am not a rabid conservative, and I am not a rabid liberal. I reject the toxicity of both the left and the right. I say this because I am as annoyed as many of you all are with people like the, let's say, for example, the Majority Report with Sam Sater, which is who literally just traffics in straw men arguments. They seem virtually incapable of making any actual legitimate argument in opposition to what Matt Walsh has to say. So, for example, at one point, they commented on one of Matt Walsh's videos where he was talking about how women are the subgroup within the human species that is of the nature to get pregnant. And their response to that was to start, rather than try to make an argument in favor of why that biological category now includes biological men who cannot get pregnant, the talking heads on the Majority Report instead started guffawing and talking about how, well, that just fits in with Matt Walsh's conservative worldview and how he sees women as just for birthing and all of that. Well, that has no bearing on the actual point he was making in the argument. No, don't get me wrong, I'm not naive. I know full well that Matt Walsh is someone who thinks that all women should be, that he wants to see women be barefoot, pregnant, and chained up in the kitchen. I get that. But he is not but he was not making that argument when he pointed out that women women constitute the biological subgroup of the human race that is of the nature to get pregnant. Whether you want to argue that the larger points about transgenderism or not, that's not what I'm here to do. I'm just using that as an example of how they deflect. I bring all of that up because I want it to be understood that I try in all matters to speak directly to what's actually going on and the actual issues at hand, and try to offer some actual insight. For example, one of the things Matt Walsh said about pornography was that it violated prostitution laws. This is actually untrue. This is a long-standing canard that people pull up against sex work. I've done a few takes of this right now, so I can't remember if I said this already, but in my wayward youth, I was a sex workers' rights advocate, so I have responses to a lot of these censorious talking points. And so anyway, the idea that pornography violates the prostitution laws is actually incorrect, because prostitution, in order to be illegal, requires that the consumer directly pay the provider for sex. That does not occur in the purchasing of pornography. The consumer is purchasing a documentation, either in print media or video, of the act of sex or of persons presenting themselves in highly sexualized ways. They are purchasing content, not the actual sexual gratification. The people paying for the sex act to be documented constitute the business entity that is not, and they are not paying, or the business entity, the porn producers, they are not paying the sex workers for their services to provide sexual gratification. They are paying the sex workers for the right to document them engaging in sexual interaction. That is the difference. So you might not like that. You might not like that. You might not think that people should be allowed to do that. But fundamentally, no, pornography does not violate the prostitution laws. By the way, this is also the reason why every so often you will hear one of these, some idiot crop up thinking they found a clever loophole to get around the prostitution laws. They think that they can, if they can videotape their interactions with prostitutes, then they're making pornography, and somehow it's not an act of prostitution. Yeah, it really doesn't work that way, because you are still at the point of sale paying somebody directly for sex. So, and there's a lot more I could go into explaining that, but rather than spend too much time on that, I would say look up the writings of a man named Mark Randazza, who's a free speech attorney who routinely works with the porn industry. He's written a lot on why that particular loophole is not a hole at all. Anyway, so moving forward, what I wanted to talk about, though, was how Matt Walsh was commenting on a recent measure that was taken in Texas to prevent or to ensure that only adults were accessing pornographic websites within the state. I believe this was only set up to be applied to Pornhub, but it might have had larger implications for other websites. But it was set up to explain. It was set up to document adults accessing or document the age verification of adults accessing Pornhub. And what that would mean was that the persons using the site were required to provide ID, some sort of government ID, to verify who they were and that they were of legal age. That might sound reasonable, but it actually becomes problematic. Now, Matt Walsh's question was, why is it that this is unacceptable when access to any other form of adult entertainment requires an ID, requires identification? And indeed, he's right. If you are going to a strip club, that requires an ID. If you are purchasing newsstand pornography, that requires an ID. If you are getting a tattoo, that requires an ID. If you are purchasing alcohol, that requires an ID. On the surface, this might seem reasonable, but there's a couple of problems with it. Number one is one that Matt Walsh is entering into, even if he doesn't realize it's what he's doing. It's the Matt Walsh began his whole preamble about pornography addiction by going on and on about how he despises the porn industry, wants to see it, in his words, burned to the ground, and have so that we could all dance on the ashes. He wants to see the industry destroyed, and that's the first and foremost problem with these kind of measures that have the semblance of being fair and reasonable. They're advocated by people who actually want to shut down the porn industry altogether. Many years ago in my wayward youth, I commented extensively on a woman named Gail Dines who was much the same. At the time, she was in favor of a filtering program on computers that computers in the UK would be required to have installed, which was essentially an anti-porn lockout filter that would be automatically turned on when a new computer was purchased, and in order to turn it off, the owner of the computer would be required to contact contact their internet service provider and switch on access to adult content. So there's two, and this was the historical context that draws the similarity between Gale's arguments and Matt Walsh's arguments. Now, again, it all seems at first to be perfectly reasonable, and the problem is Gale, by her own admission, was on her own admission, was on a mission to shut down the porn industry. And her goal, she thought she had found a way around the censorship laws by simply campaigning to enact for so much legislation that it would become impossible for the porn industry to function. Ergo, she could have her cake and eat it too. She could shut down the porn industry, stop people from consuming the media they wanted to consume, while not technically being a censor, because she was not doing it on behalf of a government media regulatory entity. Well, anyway, the thing of it is, though, and her slogan that she would use, by the way, was tie them down with legislation. So that's the first and foremost problem. That's the first and foremost reason that people push back, is because the people calling for these regulations are not calling for them in good faith. They are calling for them not with the intention of reasonably limiting minors' access to pornography. They're doing it with the intention of making it impossible for the porn industry to function at all. It's one piece in a larger, it's one piece removed from a larger Jenga tower that anti-porn advocates are trying to get to come crashing down. And so, by Matt Walsh's own admission, his larger goal is to shut down the porn industry, same as Gail Dines. And this is why I don't target the left or the right exclusively when it comes to censorship of any kind of erotic media. The left and the right, both love to jump on this train, on this bandwagon. But Gail came alongside a bunch of her fellow advocates like Anna Bridges and Robert Jensen and a lot of other people who were pushing essentially the same agenda. And so if you've followed my channel extensively, you'll know that I've commented on Gail and her chicanery in super detail, and you can get back into that if you want to. It should all still be in the archives somewhere. But anyway, so that's the first problem. The second problem is one that I originally commented on when Gail Dines was pushing for the aforementioned lockout measure, and that is that in a free society, we are not required to register with the government our intention to consume controversial media. The difference between the other point of sale measures that Matt Walsh was talking about was that they are a regular means by which the provider can guarantee that the consumer they are servicing is not a minor. If you present an ID to get a beer, and all that is happening is that the bartender is verifying that you are an adult, and then he gives you the beer, you are not required to register as an alcohol user. If you get a tattoo, you are not required to register as a tattoo receiver. If you purchase newsstand pornography, you are not required to register as a purchaser of newsstand pornography. If you attend a strip club, you are not required to register as an attendee of a strip club. In all of those cases, presenting the ID is only a matter of presenting the ID is only a matter of guaranteeing that a minor has not been served with a form of adult entertainment. Fair enough. It doesn't have the wider reaching implications of requiring people to register with the government, which is what this new measure would have required people to do. And the UK measure that Gail Dines was going on about would have required the same thing. So ultimately, essentially, people, Matt Walsh and Gail Dines, are alike in a lot more ways than either one of them would want to admit. And one of those ways is that they want to push the notion that pornography users and other consumers of erotic services are deranged, degenerate people that are existing on the outer fringes of society, and want to sort of corral all of them into an official registry of smut users, if you will, sort of like making them sex offender adjacent or something like that, having a national registry of perverts because they think that the government needs to keep track of these kind of people. That's the problem there. The proposed measures in question would serve to require people to register their intention with the government, and we are not required under the First Amendment. We are not required to enter into any kind of registry with the government when we consume media. Now, to be very clear, in all of this, we are not talking about child pornography, which by definition is the evidence of a crime, and we are not talking about any other media, which may have been, for example, the recording of somebody being raped or other illegal activity going on. We are talking specifically about the consumption of consensually created pornography, in which all of the persons involved were in fact verified to be adults and were willing to participate. Now, certainly striking down a measure like that still leaves it open for leaves open the question of, well, what do we do about children viewing pornography? And I'm glad you asked. I have an answer. The answer is that you as the parent take some responsibility as a parent and take the necessary steps to lock out your child's access to those things. There are there are readily available programs which will regulate and shut down your child's access to pornography, which will allow you as the parent to monitor what your child does on the internet. All of these things are readily available. And you have it within your capacity to use these tools to your advantage, as well you should. Because, quite frankly, your parenting of your kid is not something that should be infringing upon my rights and my civil liberties. And that includes in all matters. The Daily Wire essentially builds all of its moral vitriol out of the old, long-standing question, well, what about the children? And don't get me wrong, there are times when we should say, what about the children? There are times when people are getting away with forms of child abuse that they should not get away with, and other things like that. There are issues like Munchausen by proxy syndrome, where parents are abused by their children are abused by their parents who believe who make some kind of misguided display of their children having a medical condition that they may not actually have. Things like that. Yes, measures need to be put in place to prevent parental abuse of children. That's understandable. I get that. And the issue of Munchausen by proxy syndrome plays into a recent, very controversial public issue that I'm not going to get into in this video. But anyway, yeah, you focus on parenting your kids. Stop trying to figure out ways to make the government take the responsibility of child rearing off of you. You chose to have the kids. You parent them. Anyway, that's the answer to that. Then there's a third and final issue, which was this new this new proposed legislation would require Pornhub to display a statement saying that the consumption of pornography contributes to the trafficking of sex abuse victims, including children. That is actually a lie. That is a complete lie. That is like saying that it is such a complete lie that it's tantamount to saying that hiring U.S. citizens to work in the U.S. agricultural industry contributes to the influx of illegal immigration and undocumented labor. It is utterly ridiculous to say or argue that people who are consuming legally and consensually produced media are contributing to a market for media, which is, for media or for human interaction, which is by definition illegal. Matt Walsh I know, will never want to entertain this idea, but the actual way to push back against human trafficking and child abuse in the sex industry is to make prostitution legal. As paradoxical as that sounds, if people are able to satisfy their desires in a safe, legal, and publicly above board and regulated environment, they will not have the motivation to go into the seedy underbelly of the world and procure the services of trafficking victims and indeed trafficked children. So that said, of course, this is all coming from the Daily Wire, who is largely of the opinion that they know what's best for all of us. Furthermore, on top of that, though, that message would be a violation of the First Amendment. It would be compelled speech. So, and if you're about to ask, yes, I disagree with forcing cigarette companies to put warning labels on cigarette packages as well. Anyway, but yes, that is compelled speech. That violates our First Amendment rights. Now, Matt Walsh is supposedly an ardent opponent of compelled speech, and he's quite right to say that while, we are certainly free to honor somebody's pronouns if they so choose, nobody has the right to force other people to talk a certain way, and least of all talk a certain way when the person in question is not even present, which is what happens with pronouns. That is compelled speech, and that's a legitimate issue. Forcing them to carry that warning label is also compelled speech. So yes, that gets in the way of our First Amendment rights, especially when it comes to making people aware of things that are actually abject falsehoods born out of moral panic rather than the actual reality of the world we live in. It would be you do have a reasonable basis for example, forcing consumers I'm going to go back on something I said. I do think it's reasonable to require cigarette companies to put warning labels on their products, because at that point, that comes as I was just thinking about that. Actually, no, I need to modify my position on that, because that is that point of sale issue that we were talking about, the point at which we have to protect the consumer and the provider and all of that. So yeah, at that point there is an issue, a reasonable issue. But bringing it back around, as far as putting something on the website, no, that's a compelled speech issue. You cannot compel speech, and certainly not for the sake of warning people about non-existent problems. Anyway, I hope that makes sense. I hope that helps people understand why Matt Walsh is wrong about that.